Jake Morrison found them at dawn, staked out like hides to dry, blood caked black on skin the color of old leather. Two Apache women tall as fence posts, left to die slow in the desert sun. The buzzards had been circling since first light, patient as death itself. Jake's horse shied at the smell. Fear and dried blood mixed with the morning heat already rising off the hardpan. Cavalry sabers stood driven deep into the earth beside each stake, holding up a rough board painted with words that made his stomach turn. Apache justice. Let them rot. The younger one was barely breathing, her massive chest rising and falling like a bellows running out of wind. But the elder sister's eyes burned with defiant fury, tracking Jake's every move as he dismounted. "Please," she whispered in broken English, her voice like gravel in a dry creek. "My sister? She never hurt nobody." As Jake reached for his knife to cut the ropes, dust clouds appeared on three different horizons. Someone was coming, and they sure as hell weren't bringing good news. The wagon ride back to his failing ranch tested every prayer Jake Morrison had left in him. Each bump and rut sent fresh blood seeping through the makeshift bandages he'd torn from his own shirt. The sister's wounds told a story he didn't want to read: saber cuts, bullet grazes, and rope burns that spoke of deliberate cruelty. His war-trained instincts screamed danger with every mile. Three dust clouds meant three different groups of riders, and none of them would be happy to find him hauling Apache women across the territory. But Jake had made his choice back at those stakes, same as he'd made choices on a dozen battlefields during the war. A man either stood for something, or he fell for anything. The elder sister, Ayana, she'd managed to tell him through gritted teeth, stayed conscious despite her wounds, those black eyes never leaving his face, studying him, testing him. Jake understood that look. He'd worn it himself plenty of times when his life depended on reading another man's intentions. Her younger sister, Chenoa, drifted in and out of fevered sleep, calling out words in Apache that sounded like prayers or maybe curses. Hard to tell the difference sometimes when a person was hurting bad enough. Jake's ranch squatted in a fold of red hills like something ashamed of itself. 3 years of drought had turned his dreams of cattle empire into a graveyard of sun-bleached bones. The creek bed ran dry as dust, and the few head of cattle he had left moved like ghosts through the dead mesquite. Two wooden crosses on the hillside marked where his wife Sarah and boy Tommy lay sleeping. Consumption had taken them both in the space of a month, leaving Jake alone with his grief and a spread too big for one broken man to handle. But today, loading two unconscious Apache women into his house, Jake felt something he hadn't felt since Sarah died: purpose. The kitchen table groaned under Ayana's weight as Jake laid her out under the lamplight. Near 6.5 feet of solid muscle and bone, she dwarfed his simple furniture. Chenoa was smaller but still stood taller than most men Jake knew. No wonder their own people had problems with them. "Jake Morrison, you're gonna get yourself killed." Mrs. Patterson stood in his doorway holding a basket of cornbread, her lined face creased with worry. The old widow from the neighboring spread had been checking on him regular since Sarah passed, bringing food and unwanted advice in equal measure. "They're hurt, Martha. Hurt bad. They're Apache, Jake. Federal law says they're hostiles. Look at them." Jake gestured at the unconscious women. "You see any weapons? Any war paint? They were left to die like animals." Mrs. Patterson set down her basket and stepped closer, her expression softening as she took in the extent of their wounds. "Lord have mercy. What kind of men would do such a thing? The kind that forgot they were dealing with human beings." The old woman studied his face in the lamplight. "You always were too good for your own welfare, Jake Morrison. Your Sarah used to say the same thing." After Mrs. Patterson left with promises to keep quiet about his guests, Jake settled into the long work of cleaning wounds and fighting infection. The sister's buckskin clothing was stiff with dried blood, torn by saber and rope. He'd seen plenty of battlefield surgery during the war, but this felt different, more personal. As he worked by lamplight, heating water and cleaning cuts that should have killed them both, Jake found himself talking to the unconscious women the way he used to talk to his dying cattle. Low, steady words meant more for his own comfort than theirs. "Easy now. Nobody's gonna hurt you anymore. Not while you're under my roof." Near midnight, as he finally settled onto the floor with a blanket, giving them his bed was only right, Ayana's eyes snapped open. Her massive hand shot out and grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "My father," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He will come for us. And when he does—" Her grip tightened. Blood must pay for blood. Jake's hands shook as he heated water in his wife's old kettle, memories of battlefield surgery flooding back with each bubble that broke the surface. 3 days had passed since he'd brought the sisters home, and Chenoa's fever still burned hot enough to cook eggs. She thrashed in her delirium, calling out in Apache, words that sounded like mourning mixed with prayers. Ayana translated what she could between her own waves of pain. "She calls for our mother, dead these 5 winters past." "Fever does that," Jake said, wringing out a cloth in the warm water. "Makes the past feel closer than the present." He'd moved Sarah's old medicine kit down from the shelf, the one she'd used to doctor their boy when the consumption first took hold. Willow bark for pain, honey for infection, clean bandages torn from sheets that still smelled faintly of lavender soap. Ayana watched him work with suspicious eyes, flinching every time he reached for a fresh bandage. Trust didn't come easy when the world had spent years proving you weren't worth keeping alive. "Why?" she asked as Jake carefully cleaned a saber cut along her shoulder. "Why risk yourself for us?" Jake paused in his work, the question hitting deeper than he'd expected. Through the window, he could see the 2 crosses on the hillside where his real family rested. "Had enough death for one lifetime, I reckon. Sometimes a man's got to choose life, even when it ain't his own." On the second night, when Chenoa's fever broke and she finally opened her eyes, Jake found himself sharing his sparse pantry without thinking twice. Salt pork and beans, cornbread and coffee, simple food that tasted better when shared with folks who understood hunger. Chenoa's English came in careful pieces, learned from some long-dead missionary or trader. She thanked him with formal words that sat awkward on her tongue, but her eyes held a warmth that needed no translation. "You are kind man," she managed. "Not like—" "Not like what?" Ayana answered for her sister. "Not like soldiers. Not like the ones who put us on the stakes." That's when Jake learned about the sign they'd hung around Chenoa's neck. Apache Justice, painted in cruel letters. As if leaving 2 women to die slow in the desert sun had anything to do with justice. "They said we brought bad medicine to the tribe," Ayana continued, her voice flat as hammered iron. "Said our size made us cursed." Jake thought about that while he tended the fire, watching orange light dance across their faces. He'd known plenty of men who stood tall in body but small in spirit. Size had nothing to do with a person's worth. On the third afternoon, Doc Holliday rode out from Tombstone with news that curdled Jake's blood. The gambler-turned-dentist sat easy in his saddle, but his pale eyes held warning. "Jake, you're harboring escaped hostiles. Colonel Bradford's been asking questions all over town." "They ain't escaped. They were left to die." "That may be your truth, but Bradford don't see it that way. He's got papers from the federal government calling them enemy combatants." Jake's jaw tightened. Enemy combatants? These 2 women. Size of them. I can see how folks might be nervous. Doc's cough rattled in his chest like dice in a cup. But nervous don't make it right. Still, Bradford's offering $50 bounty for information on Apache women matching their description. After Doc rode away with promises to keep quiet, Jake found himself standing on his porch, looking out at the endless desert. $50 was more money than most folks in the territory saw in a year, enough to make good neighbors turn bad real quick. That evening, as he changed Chenoa's bandages, she suddenly sat up in bed despite her weakness. Her dark eyes found his in the lamplight. "The soldiers," she said, her English clearer now. "They did not leave us to die." Jake stopped working. "What do you mean?" "Our own people did." Tears tracked down her broad cheeks. "We are cursed, Jake Morrison. Too big for our tribe's way. And now—" her voice broke. "Now you are cursed too." 3 days passed in careful routine, and Jake Morrison discovered that healing worked both ways. While the sisters' wounds slowly closed, something in his own chest began to unknot for the first time since Sarah died. Mornings started with Chinoa teaching him Apache words for simple things. Water was tu, fire was ko, and home was goa. Her patient voice turned his clumsy tongue around sounds no white man was meant to make, but she never laughed at his mistakes. Your words, she said, pointing at the coffee pot. What you call this? Coffee. But we just say Joe, mostly. Zoe, she repeated, making it sound like music. Ayana proved herself useful around the ranch in ways that surprised them both. Her size, which had made her a burden to her tribe, turned into pure advantage when it came to ranch work. She could lift fence posts that would take two normal men to handle, and her long reach made repairs go twice as fast. Strong back, good for work, she said in her careful English, hefting a post that Jake couldn't budge. Strong back, good for family, Jake replied, and watched something change in her eyes. Evenings found them on the porch after the day's heat broke, sharing simple meals and stories that needed no common language. Jake told them about his cattle, using gestures and drawings in the dirt to explain how he'd planned to build something lasting on this hard ground. The sisters shared Apache legends through pantomime and broken English. Stories of Coyote the trickster and Eagle who carried prayers to the sky. Their hands moved like flowing water, painting pictures in the air that Jake could almost see. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Tom Bradley rode up with trouble in his eyes. Jake's neighbor had always been quick to judge and slow to forgive, but the anger in his face ran deeper than usual. Ain't natural, Jake, Bradley said, staying mounted like he might need to run. Them Apache women living in your house. They're hurt and healing. Nothing more to it. Nothing more? Bradley's voice climbed higher. Colonel's offering $50 bounty for information on escaped hostiles. $50, Jake. Then you best ride on back to town and tell him you didn't find nothing here. Bradley spat in the dust. You always were a damn fool, Morrison. But this time, you're going to get yourself killed, and maybe the rest of us with you. After Bradley rode off, Jake found the sisters had heard every word. Ayana stood at the window, her hand resting on the rifle Jake kept by the door. We bring you trouble, she said. We should go. Where? Jake asked. Back to the desert to die? Back to people who threw you away like broken tools? Chinoa's voice came soft from the kitchen. First place we ever been. Wanted. That word hit Jake harder than a mule kick. Wanted. Not needed, not useful, not tolerated. Wanted. When was the last time anyone had wanted him around? Since Sarah died, most folks treated him like a ghost haunting his own property. Well then, he said, surprised by the roughness in his own voice. Reckon this is where you belong. Later that night, as Jake banked the fire for sleep, Chinoa approached him with something in her hands. She'd been working on it for days. A torn piece of cloth mended with careful stitches, Apache beadwork decorating the edges in patterns that caught the firelight. Your shirt, she said, offering it back, was broken. Now, better. Jake took the mended shirt, running his fingers over the intricate beadwork. Nobody had mended his clothes since Sarah passed. Nobody had cared enough to try. Thank you, he managed. Chinoa stepped closer, her massive hand hovering over his chest like she was asking permission. When he nodded, she placed her palm flat over his heart, the gesture as gentle as her size allowed. You have good spirit, she said, her English careful and clear. Like my father, before war made him stone. Standing there in the firelight, Jake felt something he'd thought was dead forever. The simple comfort of being seen as worthy by another human being, not judged, not measured, not found wanting, just accepted. Outside in the darkness, coyotes began their evening song, but underneath their voices, carried on the desert wind, came a sound that made Ayana suddenly freeze. Horses, she whispered, her hand still on Jake's heart. Many horses. They come from the north. Her eyes found his in the dying firelight. Apache ponies. Dawn broke with Apache war cries echoing across the canyon like voices of the dead, but the warriors didn't attack. They watched from the ridges like hawks studying prey, their ponies' dark silhouettes against the red morning sky. Jake counted at least a dozen on the north ridge, more moving through the rocks to the east. They'd surrounded his ranch sometime during the night, quiet as shadows, patient as stone. But they held their ground, watching and waiting for something Jake couldn't figure. "Why don't they come?" he asked Ayanna as they watched from the kitchen window. Her face had gone hard as carved wood. "Apache way. Watch first. Learn the ground. Learn the enemy." "Am I the enemy?" Ayanna didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that made Jake's chest tight. "Depends on what you do when my father arrives." That's when Chenoa broke down completely, the truth pouring out of her like blood from a burst dam. She collapsed at the kitchen table, her massive frame shaking with sobs that seemed too big for any human body to hold. "We were not captured," she managed between gasps. "We were thrown away." The story came in broken pieces, each one cutting deeper than the last. The sisters hadn't been taken prisoner by cavalry or left to die by enemies. Their own tribe, their own family, had cast them out like bad luck given flesh. "Too big," Ayanna said, her voice flat as hammered iron. "Too big for hunting, too big for hiding, too big for the old ways." Jake tried to understand. In Apache culture, survival depended on stealth and speed. A hunting party couldn't afford members who snapped branches or left deep tracks. The sisters' size, which made them powerful, also made them liabilities their people couldn't afford. "Failed hunts, they blamed us," Chenoa whispered. "Bad seasons, our fault. Children sick, our bad medicine." "That's the damnedest thing I ever heard," Jake said, anger building in his chest like steam in a boiler. "Blaming folks for things they can't help. Even our father," Ayanna's voice broke. "Even he said we brought shame to the family name." Jake thought about that while he made coffee with hands that shook from more than just the morning cold. He'd known plenty of shame in his life, the shame of failing to save his family, the shame of letting his ranch fall apart, the shame of being alone in a world that seemed to have no use for broken-down ex-soldiers. But this was different. This was punishing people for the simple crime of being born different. "Size don't make a person cursed," he said finally. "Makes them different. Different ain't the same as wrong." The words seemed to hit Chenoa like a physical blow. She looked up at him with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. "You truly believe?" "I believe a man protects what's under his roof. That's the law I live by." By afternoon, the Apache presence had grown. More riders appeared on distant hills, their positions chosen to control every approach to the ranch. Jake counted at least 30 warriors, maybe more hidden in the rocks and scrub, but it was the cavalry patrol Doc Holliday had warned about that made Jake's blood run cold. 5 riders in federal blue, moving along the southern ridge like they owned every grain of sand in the territory. "They're looking for us," Ayanna said, watching through the rifle sight Jake had given her. "Let them look," Jake replied. "They won't find what they're hunting." That evening, as Jake chopped firewood behind the house, he found something that stopped him cold. An Apache arrow buried deep in his chopping block, driven there with enough force to split seasoned oak. His first instinct was to reach for his rifle, but Chenoa's gentle hand on his arm stopped him. "Not threat," she said, studying the arrow's markings. "Warning." "Warning of what?" She traced the painted symbols with one finger, her face grave. "Soldiers come with sunrise. Father sends message. Be ready." Jake pulled the arrow free, feeling its perfect balance, the careful craftsmanship that had gone into its making. This wasn't a weapon of war. This was communication from one warrior to another, a message of respect wrapped in warning. "Your father," Jake said. "He's trying to protect you. Protect us, or reclaim us." Ayanna's voice held no hope. "Apache law is clear. Blood debt must be paid." As if summoned by her words, a sound drifted across the desert that made Jake's spine crawl. Dozens of Apache war ponies moving through the darkness, their hoofbeats like distant thunder promising a storm that would change everything. The storm arrived at noon in the form of Tom Bradley and 3 neighbors, all armed and all wearing the kind of hard faces that meant talking was over. Jake met them in his yard, the sisters visible through the kitchen window like a reminder of what was at stake. "Time's come to end this foolishness, Morrison," Bradley called from his saddle. His companions, Peters from the next valley over, young Bill Crawford, and old Sam Miller, spread out like they'd planned this confrontation down to the last detail. "Nothing foolish about helping folks who need help." Jake replied, his hand resting easy on his gun belt. Folks? Peters spat tobacco juice in the dust. Them's Apache hostiles, Jake. Escaped prisoners of war. You're harboring enemies of the United States. They're hurt women, about as hostile as Sunday church. Apache's Apache, Crawford said, his young voice trying to carry more authority than his years had earned. Size of them, too, they could kill a man with their bare hands. Jake looked at each face in turn, reading the fear that had turned good neighbors into something ugly. Fear made men do stupid things, and stupid things in Apache territory got people killed. So could any of you, Jake said finally. Don't make you killers. That's when Mrs. Patterson arrived like cavalry of her own, her buggy raising dust as she pulled up sharp. The old widow climbed down with fire in her eyes and a purpose in her step that made the mounted men shift uncomfortably. Thomas Bradley, you ought to be ashamed, she snapped, riding up here like some kind of vigilante committee. Martha, this ain't your concern, Bradley replied, but his voice had lost some of its edge. Any time decent folks start talking about turning over hurt women to federal bounty hunters, it becomes every Christian's concern. She fixed each man with a stare that could have curdled milk. Your own mothers would switch you raw for even thinking such things. Before Bradley could answer, Doc Holliday appeared on the southern approach, his pale horse moving at an urgent lope. The dentist gambler pulled up just outside rifle range and called out with his characteristic politeness that somehow managed to sound like a threat. A gentleman, Mrs. Patterson. Jake. He touched his hat brim. I bring news from town that changes the complexion of things considerably. Doc's news made Jake's blood run cold as creek water in January. Colonel Bradford had arrived in Tombstone with a full cavalry troop and legal papers claiming the Apache women were federal prisoners charged with war crimes. War crimes? Jake's voice cracked with disbelief. What war crimes could they have committed tied to stakes in the desert? According to the colonel's report, they were involved in an attack on a cavalry patrol, claims they killed 3 soldiers before being captured. Jake looked through the window at Chenoa, who was carefully mending torn harness leather with the patience of someone who'd learned to make everything last. The idea of her killing anyone was like accusing a church mouse of leading a wolf pack. That's a damn lie, he said. Maybe so, Doc replied. But lies written on federal paper carry the same weight as truth. Bradford's given you 24 hours to surrender them, or he'll come collect what he considers stolen federal property. The neighbors exchanged glances that spoke louder than words. Federal property, not people, not prisoners, not even hostiles. Property that had been stolen and needed to be returned. After the others left with muttered warnings and promises to stay clear of federal business, Jake found himself preparing for siege. He cleaned his rifle, checked his ammunition, and tried to figure how 3 people could hold off a cavalry troop and however many Apache warriors were gathering in the hills. We should go, Ayana said for the 3rd time. Save you from choosing between us and your life. Already made my choice, Jake replied, working oil into his rifle's action. Made it the minute I cut those ropes. As evening approached, smoke signals began appearing on the surrounding peaks. Thin columns of controlled fire that carried messages in an ancient language Jake couldn't read. But he could read the tension in Chenoa's face as she translated what the smoke revealed. Father comes tonight, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Many warriors with him. Decision time approaches. Just after sunset, as red light faded from the western mountains, a lone Apache rider appeared on the nearest ridge. Even at distance, his bearing marked him as someone important. Someone whose word could mean the difference between life and death for everyone in the valley. The rider dismounted and stood silhouetted against the dying light, waiting with the patience of stone for an answer to a question nobody had asked yet. Chief Cochise stepped into the firelight like legend made flesh, and Jake Morrison finally understood the true weight of his choice. The Apache war leader moved with the controlled grace of a man who'd spent 30 years fighting both the U.S. Army and the laws of survival, his presence filling Jake's simple kitchen like a storm filling the sky. He spoke perfect English with the careful pronunciation of someone who'd learned the enemy's language to better defeat them. No war paint, no feathers, just a man wearing the kind of authority that came from leading warriors through impossible odds and keeping most of them alive. You are the one who cut my daughters free, he said, settling into Jake's chair like he'd been invited for Sunday dinner. Yes, sir, I am. Do you know what you have done? Before Jake could answer, the sound of approaching horses came from the south. Cavalry moving at a deliberate pace, close enough that their equipment jingled like loose change. Through the window, Jake could see torches flickering in the distance, too many to count. Colonel Bradford's voice carried across the desert with military precision. Morrison, we have this place surrounded. You will surrender the Apache hostiles or face federal charges as an accomplice. Chief Cochise never even looked toward the window. His dark eyes stayed fixed on Jake's face, reading something there that seemed to satisfy him. Federal law says my daughters belong to them, he said quietly. Apache law says they belong to the tribe that cast them out. What does Jake Morrison's law say? That's when Chenoa broke completely, the truth she'd been carrying pouring out like poison from a festered wound. She collapsed at her father's feet, her massive frame shaking with sobs that seemed to tear the air. Father, we saw, she managed between gasps. The soldier chief. He killed the little ones. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Chief Cochise went statue still, his weathered face showing nothing while his daughter spoke words that changed everything. The truth came out in broken pieces that cut deeper than any blade. The sisters hadn't been captured in battle or marked for death by tribal justice. They'd been left to die because Ayanna had witnessed Colonel Bradford executing Apache children in cold blood, 3 young ones who'd been hiding in a root cellar during a cavalry raid. He shot them like dogs, Ayanna whispered, her voice flat as hammered iron. Children who never held a weapon, never hurt nobody. Shot them because dead children don't grow up to be warriors. And you saw this? Chief Cochise asked. We both saw. We tried to stop him, but… She gestured at her size. Too big to hide, too slow to run. He marked us for death to keep his secret safe. Jake felt something cold and deadly settle in his chest. He'd seen plenty of killing during the war, but children, that crossed every line that separated soldiers from murderers. That's why the stakes, he said, understanding flooding through him. That's why the sign, make it look like tribal justice when it was really covering up war crimes. Chief Cochise rose from his chair with the fluid grace of a man half his age. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of mountains. My daughters are dead to the tribe, cast out for bringing shame to our people. He looked at each of them in turn. But you, Jake Morrison, you gave them life when their own blood threw them away. Bradford's voice came again, closer now and edged with desperation. 1 hour, Morrison. You have 1 hour to decide. Decide what? Jake asked. Apache law demands blood debt, Chief Cochise explained. Someone must pay for the harm done to my daughters. Under tribal law, that someone is you, the one who claimed them as his responsibility. Jake felt the walls closing in from all sides. Federal law wanted the sisters as prisoners. Apache law demanded blood payment for their care. And somewhere in between, a war criminal in a cavalry uniform was willing to kill anyone who threatened to expose his crimes against children. But, Chief Cochise continued, there is another way. You have shown honor in protecting the defenseless. You have proven yourself worthy of the name brother. The chief's proposal hit Jake like a physical blow. Adoption into the Apache tribe, marriage to one of the daughters to make the relationship legal under both systems of law. It would protect the sisters under tribal law and give Jake standing to speak for them in any federal court. Think carefully, Chief Cochise warned. Choose Apache law and you become Apache. Choose federal law and my daughters die in a cavalry prison. Choose your own law. He let the sentence hang unfinished as Bradford's ultimatum echoed across the desert one final time. 1 hour to decide between 3 impossible choices. With armies gathering in the darkness and time running out like sand through broken fingers, the church bell in distant Tombstone chimed 9 o'clock and all hell broke loose. Cavalry charged from 3 directions like blue death flowing across the desert, their sabers catching moonlight as they converged on Jake's ranch. From the northern hills, Apache warriors poured down like water finding its level. war cries splitting the night air with sounds older than civilization. Jake threw himself against the kitchen table as the first bullets shattered his windows, glass raining down like deadly snow. Ayanna was already at her position by the east window, Jake's spare rifle looking small in her massive hands but steady as bedrock. "Hold your fire," Jake shouted over the chaos. "Let them come closer." The ranch house had been built by a man who understood frontier realities. Thick adobe walls, small windows, clear fields of fire in every direction. What Jake hadn't counted on was fighting a three-way battle where he couldn't tell friend from enemy. Chenoa moved through the chaos like she'd been born to it, her healer's hands now loading rifles and passing ammunition. A bullet creased her shoulder, drawing blood, but she never slowed down. "Apache not shooting at house," she called over the gunfire. "Only at blue coats." She was right. The warriors were targeting cavalry positions, trying to prevent them from reaching the ranch rather than joining the attack. But caught in the middle, Jake and the sisters were taking fire from federal forces who saw them all as hostiles. Through the smoke and muzzle flashes, Jake caught sight of Colonel Bradford directing his troops from a safe distance. The cavalry officer was trying to take the sisters alive. Dead women couldn't testify to war crimes, but they also couldn't be questioned about what they'd witnessed. A lull in the firing brought an unexpected sound, wagon wheels and voices from the southern approach. Jake risked a look through the broken window and felt his heart lift for the first time since the shooting started. Doc Holliday rode point for a group of townspeople armed with everything from hunting rifles to shotguns. Mrs. Patterson sat straight-backed in her buggy, a double-barreled scattergun across her knees like she was heading to a church social. "Federal bullies," she called out in a voice that carried across the battlefield. "Murdering children and calling it justice. Decent folks won't stand for it." The arrival of civilian witnesses changed everything. Bradford couldn't conduct a massacre with half of Tombstone watching, but he also couldn't let the truth about dead Apache children reach territorial authorities. Jake watched the colonel's desperation grow as his options disappeared. The man had painted himself into a corner with his own crimes, and now he was trapped between Apache warriors who wanted justice and townspeople who demanded accountability. "Cease fire!" Bradford's voice cracked with authority he no longer possessed. "I'm approaching under a flag of truce." The shooting died to nervous silence broken only by the sound of wounded horses and men. Bradford walked toward the ranch house alone, his white handkerchief tied to his saber, but Jake could see the lie in every step. The colonel's face had gone gray with fear and fury. His military career was over if the truth emerged, his pension gone, his reputation destroyed. Men facing that kind of loss did desperate things. "Morrison," he called when he reached the porch. "You're harboring federal prisoners and enemy combatants. Surrender them now or face charges of treason." "They ain't prisoners," Jake replied from behind his barricaded door. "They're family." "Family?" Bradford's laugh held no humor. "You call those Apache giants family? I call them women who witnessed you murder children in cold blood." The words hit Bradford like physical blows. His hand dropped to his sidearm, the flag of truce forgotten in his desperation. "Lies," he snarled. "Apache lies told by Apache hostiles." "Then you won't mind explaining it to a territorial judge." Bradford's mask finally slipped completely. Jake could see the killer underneath the uniform now. The kind of man who shot children and slept soundly after. "Dead hostiles can't tell lies," Bradford said, drawing his weapon. The shot that rang out came not from his gun, but from an unexpected direction entirely. Mrs. Patterson's buffalo rifle spoke with authority that sent Bradford's pistol spinning into the darkness, the colonel crying out as he clutched his wounded hand. "Thomas Bradford," Doc Holliday called, riding forward with papers in his hand. "By authority of the territorial government, you're under arrest for murder of non-combatants and conduct unbecoming an officer." As federal authority crumbled like a house built on sand, Chief Cochise emerged from the darkness with 50 warriors at his back. But instead of continuing the fight, he raised his hand for peace. The siege was over, but Jake Morrison's real test was just beginning. "The evidence is overwhelming, Colonel," Doc Holliday announced, unfolding official papers in the firelight that had replaced gunfire. Photographs, witness statements, testimony from 3 different Apache bands. You're finished. Colonel Bradford stood clutching his wounded hand, his career bleeding out as surely as his flesh. The territorial marshal Doc had brought from Tucson stepped forward with iron shackles, but Bradford's eyes held the desperate gleam of a cornered rattlesnake. Apache testimony won't hold in any federal court, he snarled. Hearsay and savage lies. Maybe, Doc replied with his characteristic politeness, but Mrs. Patterson's photographs will. The old widow had been busy during the past week, her box camera capturing evidence that would hang a man. Pictures of the massacre site, the children's bodies, the spent cavalry cartridges that proved federal involvement. In an age when photographs didn't lie, Bradford's denials crumbled like sandcastles in a storm. Chief Cochise stepped into the light with the dignity of a man who'd spent 30 years fighting for his people's survival. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of mountains and the authority of absolute truth. My daughters saw what they saw, but pictures. He gestured at Mrs. Patterson's camera equipment. Pictures speak in the white man's tongue. Jake watched Bradford's face cycle through fury, fear, and finally, a cold acceptance that sent ice through his veins. A man with nothing left to lose was the most dangerous animal on earth. If I'm going down, Bradford said, his voice deadly quiet, I'm taking those Apache bitches with me. His wounded hand moved toward the hideout gun in his boot, but Jake was already moving. 3 years of grief and isolation had ended the moment he'd cut those ropes in the desert, and he'd be damned if Bradford would destroy the family he'd found at the cost of everything else. But the shot that ended the standoff came from an unexpected source. Chief Cochise's rifle spoke with quiet authority, and Bradford dropped like a sack of grain, his hideout gun spinning harmlessly into the dust. Justice, the chief said simply, smoke still rising from his barrel. In the sudden silence that followed, Jake felt the weight of 30 different gazes. Apache warriors, cavalry troopers, townspeople, and federal marshals all trying to figure out what came next. Blood had been spilled, but whose law would govern the aftermath? That's when Chief Cochise did something that changed everything. Jake Morrison, he said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. You have proven yourself worthy. You protected my daughters when their own people cast them out. You chose honor over safety, family over law. The Apache chief stepped forward, his weathered hands steady as stone. I offer you adoption into our tribe. You become my son. My daughters become your sisters under Apache law. What says your heart? Jake looked at Ayanna and Chenoa, these 2 women who'd transformed his failing ranch into something that felt like home again. The silence stretched like a held breath while he considered what the chief was really offering. More than legal protection, though that mattered, more than cultural bridge building, though the territory needed it, he was being offered the thing he'd lost when Sarah and Tommy died, family that chose him just as much as he chose them. I accept, Jake said, his voice carrying clearly across the desert night. The ceremony was simpler than Jake had expected. Chief Cochise placed his hands on Jake's shoulders, speaking words in Apache that seemed to pull strength from the earth itself. Then Ayanna and Chenoa stepped forward, each placing a hand over his heart in the same gesture Chenoa had used by the fire. Brother, Ayanna said, the English word carrying weight it had never held before. Brother, Chenoa echoed, tears tracking down her broad cheeks. Under Apache law, Jake Morrison had just become something unprecedented. A white man adopted into the tribe, with legal standing to speak for his new sisters in any court, territorial or federal. More importantly, he'd become part of a family that measured worth by character rather than blood. Doc Holliday cleared his throat diplomatically. Well then, that settles the matter of jurisdiction. Tribal members accused of federal crimes get tried in territorial court, not military tribunal. The territorial marshal nodded, understanding the implications. And with Bradford dead, there's nobody left to press charges anyway. As the crowd began to disperse, Apache warriors melting back into the hills, cavalry troopers following their new commanding officer toward Tombstone, townspeople loading into wagons for the long ride home, Jake found himself standing in his yard with his new family. So, he said, looking at the women who'd transformed from strangers to sisters in the space of a week. What do we do now? Chenoa's answer came with a smile that could have lit up the desert. Now we go home, brother. We build something good on this hard ground. Part 9. Resolution of Conflict. 1,400 words. 3 months later, Jake Morrison's ranch thrived like it never had before, and the sound of laughter echoed across the desert where once only wind and sorrow had lived. The transformation had started with water. Ayana's knowledge of Apache ways had led them to a hidden spring in the northern hills that white men's maps had never marked. Following ancient signs, the way certain plants grew, how rocks weathered in patterns that spoke of underground streams, she'd guided Jake to a source that had been flowing since before the first Spanish explorer set foot in the territory. Water is life, she'd said in her careful English, watching clear liquid bubble up from limestone depths. Apache know where life hides. The spring had ended 3 years of drought that had turned Jake's cattle dreams into a graveyard of sun-bleached bones. Now his remaining stock moved sleek and fat through grass that grew green even in the desert heat. The creek bed that had run dry since Sarah died now carried a steady flow that attracted wildlife from 50 miles around. But it was Chenoa's healing knowledge that had truly saved the ranch. A wasting disease had been slowly killing his cattle, something the white veterinarian in Tombstone couldn't identify or treat. Chenoa had taken one look at the sick animals and known exactly what was wrong. Bad grass, she'd explained, pointing to a patch of seemingly innocent green that grew near the old water holes. Looks good, tastes good, kills slow. Her Apache medicine, a mixture of desert plants that she gathered according to moon phases and ancient recipes, had cured every head of cattle on the place. Word had spread quickly through the territory. Now ranchers rode from as far as Tucson seeking the Apache woman who could heal anything with 4 legs. The ranch house itself had grown in ways that honored both cultures. Adobe additions built with Apache techniques created rooms that stayed cool in summer and warm in winter. A traditional ramada stretched across the front porch, its mesquite posts and brush roof providing shade where the family gathered each evening. Jake had learned to appreciate silence in a way he never had before. Apache culture valued the spaces between words, the communication that happened through gesture and shared understanding rather than constant chatter. It suited a man who'd spent too many years alone with his thoughts, teaching him that quiet could be companionship rather than loneliness. The community that had formed around the ranch surprised everyone, including Jake. Other outcasts began appearing like desert flowers after rain. A half-breed trader named Miguel who'd been rejected by both Mexican and American communities, an ex-slave named Joseph who'd fought for the Union and found no welcome in either North or South, even a few Apache warriors who'd grown tired of constant warfare. Misfits and castaways, Mrs. Patterson had called them during one of her weekly visits, her camera equipment loaded in the back of her buggy. Lord's own collection of folks who don't fit anywhere else. But they fit here. Miguel's knowledge of Mexican silverworking techniques had proven invaluable when they'd discovered ore deposits in the northern hills. Joseph's experience with Union Army logistics had helped Jake organize supply runs and plan improvements. The Apache warriors brought skills in tracking and desert survival that no textbook could teach. Mrs. Patterson herself had become the unofficial chronicler of what she called the Great Experiment. Her photographs of the mixed community working together had reached newspapers as far away as San Francisco, turning Jake's ranch into a symbol of what the frontier could become when people chose cooperation over conquest. The most surprising regular visitor was Chief Cochise himself. No longer arriving as a war leader with painted warriors at his back, he came as a father checking on his daughter's welfare. The peace treaty he'd negotiated with territorial authorities, based on the mutual respect demonstrated at Jake's ranch, had ended 3 decades of warfare in the region. "You have given my daughter something I could not," he told Jake during one visit, watching Ayana teach a group of neighbor children how to read animal tracks in the sand, a place where their size makes them strong instead of cursed. The legal aftermath had proven simpler than expected. Colonel Bradford's court-martial, conducted posthumously based on Mrs. Patterson's photographic evidence, had resulted in sweeping changes to federal Indian policy. The pictures she'd taken became evidence in congressional hearings that led to the removal of 3 other cavalry commanders and new regulations protecting non-combatants. Jake's Apache adoption had been recognized by territorial courts, establishing legal precedent for cross-cultural family formations. Lawyers were calling it the Morrison precedent, though Jake preferred to think of it as common sense finally catching up to human decency. The ranch had become profitable in ways Jake had never imagined. The silver deposits weren't anything like the great strikes in other parts of the territory, but they provided steady income that funded improvements and expansion. More importantly, the combination of Apache knowledge and ranching techniques had created cattle that actually thrived in desert conditions. Other ranchers were beginning to visit, learning methods that could transform the entire industry in the Southwest. Jake found himself hosting informal schools where white cattlemen learned from Apache wisdom, breaking down prejudices one practical lesson at a time. On this particular evening, as autumn painted the desert in shades of gold and purple, Jake sat on his expanded porch watching Chenoa prepare medicine for a neighbor's sick horse while Ayana demonstrated proper arrow-making technique to a fascinated audience of children from 3 different cultures. The graves on the hillside were still there, still tended with flowers that Chenoa grew in the restored garden, but they no longer felt like an ending. They felt like a foundation. The love he'd shared with Sarah and Tommy had taught him how to recognize and accept the love his new family offered. He was happy, not the desperate, grasping happiness of a man trying to recapture the past, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd found his proper place in the world. The empty spaces in his chest had filled with something stronger than what he'd lost. A family chosen rather than inherited. Bonds forged in crisis rather than blood. A letter from the territorial governor lay on the table beside him, offering Jake appointment as Indian agent for the region. The position would make him officially responsible for mediating between Apache bands and white settlements, using his unique legal status as an adopted tribal member to prevent future conflicts. "What do you think?" he'd asked his sisters when the letter arrived. "Think you already doing the job," Ayana had replied with one of her rare smiles. "Might as well get paid for it." As the last light faded from the western mountains, the evening ritual began. Neighbors headed home to their own spreads, workers finished their tasks, and the 3 members of the Morrison family gathered on the porch for coffee and conversation. Chenoa settled her considerable bulk into the chair Jake had built specifically to accommodate her size, steam rising from the cup she cradled in her massive hands. Ayana took her usual position, leaning against the porch rail, her keen eyes scanning the horizon out of habit developed during years of danger. The desert had come alive with evening sounds, coyotes beginning their nightly chorus, the rustle of small creatures moving through brush, the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. But underneath it all was something that had been missing from this place for too long, the sound of a home where people belonged. "Brother Jake," Chenoa said, beginning their nightly ritual with the question that had become their evening prayer. "What makes a family real?" Jake considered the question, watching a hawk circle overhead in the dying light. It was a question they explored together most evenings, finding new answers in the simple fact of their continued existence as a unit that worked, that chose each other daily despite having every reason to drift apart. "Choice," he said finally, the word carrying weight earned through months of proving it true. Family's real when people choose to stay, especially when staying gets hard. When they see your worst and decide you're worth keeping anyway. The 3 of them sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over their small kingdom, each lost in thoughts of how far they'd traveled from those torture stakes in the desert to this moment of perfect peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new neighbors to win over, new problems to solve. But tonight, they were simply family, chosen, tested, and proven strong enough to last. Now I reckon some of you listening might think this here story's just frontier foolishness, tales of Apache sisters and stubborn ranchers from a time long past. But let me tell you something, friend. That desert where Jake Morrison made his stand ain't so different from the ground we're walking today. Every one of us has stood where Jake stood, facing a choice between what's easy and what's right. Maybe you never found giant Apache sisters staked out in the sand, but you've seen folks treated poorly just for being different. You've watched good people get cast aside for things they can't help. Their size, their color, their way of speaking, the struggles that mark them as somehow other in a world that prizes sameness over substance. Jake Morrison knew something we sometimes forget in our busy modern world. A man's worth ain't measured by what he's got in the bank or how he looks in a photograph. It's measured by what he's willing to give up for someone who can't give him nothing back, by whether he'll stand up when everybody else sits down. Those Apache sisters taught Jake, and maybe they can teach us, that family ain't always the folks you're born to. Sometimes it's the people who choose to stay when staying gets hard. Sometimes the strongest bonds are forged in the hardest times, between folks who got nothing in common except the courage to care. In this old world full of noise and hurry, maybe we could use a little more of that desert silence, the kind where you listen with your heart instead of your ears, where you see people for who they are inside, not what they look like outside, where size and difference become sources of strength rather than shame. If this old tale touched something in you, if it reminded you of what really matters, well, maybe you'd share it with someone who needs to remember that they ain't alone. Sometimes a story's the best medicine for a wounded spirit, the gentlest way to remind folks that there's still room in this world for the kind of love that chooses courage over comfort. Until next time, remember, in the end, we're all just folks trying to find our way home. And sometimes, if we're real lucky, we find that home ain't a place at all. It's the people who choose to love us, size and all.